Hello, and welcome to episode 4 of the Millennium Pod, a Star Wars podcast by me, Ari, at ari.in.space on TikTok and at the Millennium Pod, all one word, on Instagram. Whether you are new listening today or you've been listening for the last few weeks, thank you for being here. I truly appreciate it, and I'm really excited to get into some Star Wars stuff today with you. If you have listened to my previous episodes, today's episode is going to be a little bit different than what I've been doing. Previously on the show, I've been doing what I'm going to call, persuasive pieces, where I talk about my opinion/experience with some part of the story told in Star Wars. Today, however, I kind of want to switch gears a little bit and talk about some Star Wars science. Now, you can't see me make air quotes with I say the word science, but as someone with a Bachelor of Science in Physics and Chemistry, I can say with certainty that Star Wars loves to break the rules of real science and make its own quote-unquote science. But as someone who is interested in real science, I am also very interested in the quote-unquote science of science fiction, because after all, science fiction is just an extension of what we already know and what we may hope to one day know. So, welcome to Star Wars Science Class. Today's lesson is Hyperspace. So I recently finished reading Light of the Jedi, which is the first book in the new High Republic series. I guess it's a series, which, by the way, is an excellent read. If you haven't read it yet and you're a Star Wars fan, I would very strongly recommend reading it, especially if you're interested in exploring, a new era of Star Wars, one where we haven't really seen before, and the Jedi are at their prime. But anyway, this book starts, and this is not a spoiler because I'm taking it from the description of the book, but the book starts with a hyperspace disaster where suddenly material is just flying out of hyperspace and colliding with a system in the outer rim, which is obviously going to be pretty catastrophic because coming out of hyperspace, this material is traveling at or above light speed, so anything this material impacts is likely to vaporize. And anyway, all that to say, this got me thinking about hyperspace and how I actually don't really know how it works in the context of Star Wars. And so this inspired a quick search on Wikipedia and StarWars.com, and next thing I know, I have about 72 tabs open on my computer. So I decided to compile kind of what I learned about hyperspace into a hopefully simple explanation, because if you're like me, you probably just dismiss it as a fun Star Wars thing, but there's actually some interesting things to know if that's of interest. So welcome to Hyperspace 101, where we will be discussing what I think is the coolest parts of hyperspace in Star Wars, as well as potential real-world possibilities of intergalactic space travel. So what is hyperspace and hyperspace travel? Like what is it? And this explanation is coming from the perspective of how hyperspace is used in Star Wars specifically. Other sci-fi franchises like Star Trek have similar concepts, but this is from a Star Wars point of view. And basically, it's an alternate space-time dimension, and you can only get into this dimension by a molecular displacement if you are traveling at or faster than the speed of light. And it sort of mirrors real space, this dimension. Well, it doesn't sort of. It does, because every point in hyperspace corresponds to a point in real space, and these points in hyperspace are known as hyperspace shadows, and that's why it's important to travel on known hyperlanes in order to avoid potential collisions with planets, stars, or other material. And in order to get to hyperspace, a ship needs a hyperdrive, and hyperdrives manipulate something that's called hypermatter, which is the fuel that is used in hyperdrives. And hypermatter reactions are also what powered the Death Star, like the killer laser for planets. So for simplicity's sake, let's say that hypermatter is just basically special gasoline. That's a lot. So summary so far: use special gas to drive faster than the speed of light and you will enter another dimension. And I mean, that's pretty much it. My honest advice, don't think about it too much or it'll just make your brain hurt. Limitations to hyperspace travel included, first of all, the need for a hyperspace lane to travel safely. As I mentioned, the mass shadows from real planets in hyperspace could be potentially fatal. And so that's why you needed to make sure you were in a lane that was clear of obstructions. Additionally, in theory, a ship shouldn't be able to jump to hyperspace from inside a gravity well. And a gravity well is the pull of gravity that a large thing, such as a planet or a star, exerts. But much like how Star Wars likes to break the rules of real science, it also likes to break the rules of its own fake science. And there are several instances when a ship jumps to hyperspace from within a gravity well, such as when the rebels are escaping the exploding Jedi in Rogue One, and also when ships drop out of hyperspace into a gravity well, such as when the Millennium Falcon is entering Starkiller Base while traveling at light speed in The Force Awakens. So this should be a limitation as defined by Star Wars, but thanks to plot armor and heroes needing to be heroic, it is not in these situations. So now let's talk about the quote-unquote science of hyperspace in Star Wars and, its implications to the galaxy as a whole. So we know that in Star Wars, a ship can only travel on these established hyperspace lanes to avoid collisions. And there are 5 major hyperspace trade routes known in Star Wars, if you want to know what they are. They're the Corellian Run, the Corellian Trade Spine, the Hydeid Way, the Perlimian Trade Route, and the Rima Trade Route. And hyperspace lanes in Star Wars work a lot like, roads or highways in our world. Often to get somewhere, this starships would need to take more than one hyperspace lane or road, which would require dropping out of hyperspace at specific points in order to switch lanes. Good thing they have computers to be their space GPS. And often, especially in the movies, they don't really emphasize this, but we do see in Clone Wars and Rebels, there are sometimes groups or planets or whatever, blocking certain hyperspace lanes, or only some people are allowed to use them, and having access to different hyperspace lanes could really help in a war, especially, getting those lanes that go out to the Outer Rim and such. And so they are actually quite important, and it's a shame that they're not emphasized as much in the movies, but thankfully we do have the TV shows which show just how important they can be. And then additionally, someone like Han Solo or Hondo Ohnaka would probably know like thousands of these lanes, just kind of, they would know the back roads essentially, which is kind of interesting. It definitely would be an advantage to know of, tons of different hyperspace lanes that you could use to get wherever you needed in the galaxy. Now, I absolutely cannot talk about hyperspace and hyperspace lanes without mentioning the Purrgil. So, Purrgil, if you're not aware, are first introduced in the Rebels episode, The Call. As a side note, this is actually one of my favorite Rebels episodes because it shows the importance of trusting your instincts of something over preconceived ideas, which is a really great theme, especially for Star Wars. But anyway, we find out that these whale-looking creatures are capable of hyperspace travel. And as a result, they're a bit of a pest because they often will collide with ships traveling in hyperlanes. Purrgil don't follow hyperlanes, or at least not the ones defined by sentient beings. And so that they are considered a bit of a pest. Although, from the perspective of Purrgil, it would probably appear that starships are actually the pests, seeing as it was from the study of Purrgil that sentient beings desired to also travel through hyperspace, which resulted in the invention of the hyperdrive. So without Purrgil, there would be no hyperspace, which is quite interesting. Little side thing you find out, if you watch the TV shows. And another fun fact about Purrgil, I guess, additional studies of Purrgil brain function inspired both Jedi and Sith to create wayfinders to get through challenging parts of space, much like the Sith wayfinder used to get to Exegol in The Rise of Skywalker. It's also rumored that the 12-parsec route Han took for the Kessel Run is actually an ancient Purrgil migration trail. So that's kind of cool too. Okay, now this is all fine and dandy and great, but how do Purrgil, these space whales, actually travel via hyperspace? Well, the answer is pretty simple. They need to inhale this green gas known as Clauson 36, and once they have enough of it in their bodies, they metabolize it into hypermatter, which then they use to jump to hyperspace. So, Purrgil are very strange, but very interesting and obviously very useful because from them we learned how to travel via hyperspace. Okay, so now that we know the basics of hyperspace travel, I want to talk about a point of what I think is very unnecessary contention among Star Wars fans, and that is the Holdo Maneuver. When Vice Admiral Holdo, who by the way is very cool, jumped to hyperspace directly through the First Order Star Destroyers in The Last Jedi. Now, a lot of fans like to use this scene to discredit the sequels as a whole, claiming that this doesn't make sense with previous Star Wars lore, and that if this was a real thing in Star Wars, then why wouldn't more people do it, use droids to send ships through other ships, thereby destroying them? Well, the main explanation is that, as Finn describes in The Rise of Skywalker, this really is a 1 in a million shot. That is, to have the calculations line up so that for the briefest moment that the starship is accelerating to light speed in order to get into hyperspace, it would hit its target, in this case a Star Destroyer, at that astronomical speed, and then incite vast destruction. It's really a 1 in a million shot, like he says. And because it would be such a risk, it wouldn't be worth risking just any ship unless it was, like is the case in The Last Jedi, kind of a last-ditch effort. Now, there is some debate as to whether hyperspace is achieved instantaneously, like if there even is that brief moment of acceleration. And from the way hyperspace is explained in canon Star Wars, it's achieved by traveling at or above light speed, which means you have to be traveling this fast to enter hyperspace. And no matter how fast you accelerate, there will always be that brief, infinitesimal amount of time in which you are accelerating but not yet in hyperspace, and that is how Holdo did it. Thanks to some lucky calculations, she was able to hit the Star Destroyer while accelerating to light speed. And I mean, if you still don't buy it, that's fine. I do understand why it's questioned, and there are definitely some valid arguments on both sides, whether the Holdo Maneuver makes sense in the context of Star Wars. At the end of the day, however, to me, you can either enjoy this scene, which is visually stunning, and just an overall cool concept, or you can use it as a weapon against the sequel trilogy. Personally, I choose to enjoy it. Also, I mentioned the fact that even though hyperspace jumps shouldn't be possible in gravity wells, I mentioned that to basically say that Star Wars does whatever it wants, even with its own parameters. So, like, sure, we have never seen the Holdo Maneuver, but that doesn't mean it's not possible and it ruins Star Wars. So now I want to move on to what I think is the most exciting part of this podcast, and that is this even realistic, like in terms of real life? Is there some form of interdimensional light speed travel that we could make possible? I mean, obviously this isn't a thing that exists right now, but is it even in the realm of possibility? And the short answer is, with what we know about physics now and the technology we have, it's pretty much impossible. As a theory, maybe. There is a lot we don't understand about space-time, so to say definitively that it's not possible is wrong. We can't prove it's possible, but we also can't prove it's not possible, so therefore the answer is maybe it's possible. So the first limit that we encounter in terms of thinking about whether this is actually a real possibility in real life is that in Star Wars, in order to enter hyperspace, a ship must be traveling at or beyond the speed of light. And more often than not, ships are traveling like way faster than the speed of light. If ships in Star Wars could only travel at the speed of light, then Han's 12 parsec Kessel Run would have taken him just about 40 years. So we're traveling at or above the speed of light all the time in Star Wars. In real life, light speed is known as the universal speed limit thanks to Einstein and his theory of special relativity. It's predicted, according to this theory, that an object with mass, like a starship, obviously, would require an infinite amount of energy to travel at light speed. So that's bad. But we found a loophole in Einstein's theory, and that's that this speed limit only applies to matter and energy. So space and time can travel faster than light. We saw this with the Big Bang, and we continue to see, well, not actually see, but observe and theorize that space-time travels faster than the speed of light. First, yes, when the Big Bang happened and our universe was initially created, space and time expanded faster than the speed of light. And this continues to happen currently as the universe is always expanding. So how does this loophole, how does this help us anyway? Well, physicist Miguel Alcubierre has proposed the idea for a concept now known as the Alcubierre warp drive. And basically how this works is we would have an elliptical-shaped starship attached to a giant ring encircling it. Now, if you've seen a lot of Star Wars, you might be picturing, like me, the hyperspace ring with the smaller starfighters that don't have a hyperdrive in them that allows them to travel in hyperspace. That's what it would look like, yes. Not at all the same concept. This ring that would be surrounding the starship would be made up of exotic matter, which is matter that has properties that violate the laws of physics, such as having a negative mass. And this exotic matter ring would basically warp space and time around the starship, which would create a region of expanded space behind the starship and contracted space in front of it. It would kind of look like if you imagine, when a surfer is riding a wave and the wave almost seems like it's bigger behind them but smaller in front of them. That's the same. That's exactly what it would look like if we could see it. And so the starship in question would basically kind of be in this space-time bubble of flat space within the warped space-time. And in this way, the starship wouldn't be traveling faster than light because it's in its own little bubble of flat space. Just the space-time around it is traveling faster than light, which would essentially carry the starship to its destination. Of course, energy requirements for this kind of thing are quite huge. You can read about studies of how they're trying to think about ways to reduce this energy, but it's still very large amounts of energy required. And then additionally, it's not like we can just walk outside and grab some exotic matter to warp space-time. So this theory does have a lot to be worked on, but it does have interesting potential. And the other sort of theory that we have kind of going for potential intergalactic space travel would be the use of wormholes, which are basically a theory that it's 2 points in space that are connected via a sort of tunnel. So what would normally take a really long time to go the long way around, you can just shoot through the tunnel and boom, you're there. Unfortunately, we haven't actually observed wormholes in real life. They do exist in mathematics, which sounds a little bit weird, but what that basically means is we have the math of wormholes and it can be used to help solve other space-time equations. So pretty good evidence that they probably could exist. We just haven't seen them yet. The other issue with wormholes is usually they're very small, predictably, of course, on the size of atoms. And so obviously nobody but maybe Ant-Man could use them. So that's not very useful either. And additionally, they are collapsing and very unstable. And so travelers would likely be lost if there was one that was actually big enough to enter. Not to say that it couldn't be possible, to potentially use something like suggested in the Alcubierre warp drive where we're warping space-time to stabilize a wormhole, but that's all very far out. But it is interesting to think about, and I think it's really interesting. I'm always trying to read up on this stuff, so but that is pretty much all we kind of have going for potential hypotheses on how intergalactic space travel could potentially work. Like I said earlier, just because we can't prove it's possible doesn't mean it isn't, because we also can't prove it's not possible. And humans have only ever existed in three-dimensional space, so it's very difficult to understand the possibility of space travel through other dimensions. But like I say, that doesn't mean it's impossible. I, for myself, remain very optimistic that while it almost certainly will not be in my lifetime, but I mean, I'm optimistic that maybe one day humans will have some kind of wild science fiction level of space travel that's possible. So anyway, that brings me to the end of today's episode. I hope that maybe you learned something new, or maybe you didn't, but it got refreshed in your brain, and that's always cool too. As always, please feel free to reach out to me on social media. Do not hesitate at all if that's something you're inclined to do. I would love to hear from you, and have a fantastic day, night, evening, morning, I don't know, whatever it is, wherever you are. And as always, may the Force be with you.